Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar on the HathiTrust Statement of Values. I'm here with Executive Director Mike Furlough and Board of Governors member Robert McDonald from the University of Colorado Boulder. I've also got here Jessica Rohr, our member engagement communications specialist. Before I turn it over to Mike and Robert, I'm going to do a little housekeeping. Right, so this session we have quite a few people, so we're asking that you please keep your microphone muted during the presentation, also your camera. If you have a question, you can type that into the chat at any time. Jessica Rohr will be monitoring the chat and will ask questions aloud to Mike and Robert at the appropriate time at the end of the presentation. If you want to ask a question aloud that will be okay during the appointed time, we just ask that you use the raise hand feature and wait for Jessica to call on you. Also, live captioning has been enabled today. You can turn that on by using the live transcript button, and you should see at the bottom right of your screen. Please note that these are automated transcriptions. It's not a live transcription, so you might see several typos. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to Jessica to get us started.
Great, thank you, Melissa. So just to talk a bit about what we'll be covering today. So Mike is going to share a bit the history of the Statement of Values, how it came to be, and its purpose in the organization once they are finalized. Mike and Robert will have a conversation. They have been thinking a lot about this, and we'll have some details to share and some thoughts. And we do have time then for Q&A at the end of the session, as Melissa said. But if you've got questions as they're going along, feel free to drop them in the chat and I will pick them up either at the end or in the middle if appropriate. So next slide, please. So the timeline that we are working on here for the Statement of Values, we are very much committed to hearing the voices of our members in this process. As a member-driven organization, we need to make sure that what we're doing, what we're thinking about really is aligned with our membership. So we have engaged very broadly. We've asked you and others at your institution to provide feedback in the format of a survey and also here in these webinars. So what will happen then once the survey closes this Friday, March 19th, we will take all that feedback back into kind of discussion among board members and other members to make revisions, with the final act being a vote of ratification by member representatives beginning in May. So that is where we are headed, where we've been. So again, if you haven't already done the survey, you can do so until this Friday. We'll be sending it out again after this session. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike at this point to really get us started.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon and or this morning, depending upon your time zone. Robert's in the morning. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. And Melissa, why don't you advance to the next slide? The first thing I wanted to do in talking about this today was really ground this conversation in the mission and the vision of HathiTrust, the work that we do, why we exist. All of our priorities, all of our programs, all of our services are intended to support this mission that you see on the screen now, which is really very much focused on preservation and access, right? Access to the collective or the cultural scholarly record, and working with libraries in order to ensure that that access is provided to their users. The mission really puts the emphasis on library functions in a lot of ways, emphasizing traditional roles of collecting and making accessible and organizing. But in our vision, we want to make really clear that we are definitely working on this for the good of users, right? We're really focusing on the student, the researcher, the teacher. They're the intended audience for what we're aggregating, what we're preserving, and what we're all collecting and collectively providing here. So on the next slide, I thought I would talk a few minutes or a minute or so about what purpose the Statement of Values serves, why a Statement of Values, and how it fits alongside the mission. I've been describing them, and we've been talking about them internally with the board in this kind of way. The statement of values will be foundational principles. They'll guide and shape how we execute the mission. They'll guide and shape how we work through our operations, our financial investments, our programs, and our service developments. They're not goals. They're not a strategic plan. They're not a tactical plan. They don't tell us exactly what to do, but they give us reference on how to do what we do and how we should be doing what we do, if that's not too meta. Your library probably has a value statement. It might not all do. If you do, then it's quite likely that your own institutional circumstances and the mission and values of your parent organization, if you're at a university, for instance, might play a role in how you articulated the values for your library. And that's going to be variable from place to place. I would bet there's a fair amount of similarity and alignment across them, but they're not going to be worded exactly the same, and some might give more priority to one thing or another. But I think it's important to note here that these values are about helping HathiTrust staff, board members, governance, et cetera. Those of us who are working on behalf and through HathiTrust to do the work of the organization, they're there to guide us. We don't expect them to match verbatim yours in your libraries, but we want you to see these and recognize yourselves and your organizations in them. We want these values to be aligned with our members, even if they don't exactly match what you have in your institution. Let's go on to the next slide and talk a little bit about the path that got us here and why we're focusing on this today. The statement, as you've heard, it's new, but it doesn't mean that this is necessarily a major turn or big shift in our work. As we've developed the statement that we're sharing today, I think it's important to note that we've drawn a lot on our organizational history and the ways we've worked in the past. A few years ago, when we were developing our current strategic directions, we've referenced a number of intentions that were values-based, but that was really an incomplete list. And it got us thinking a little bit about the need to enunciate, articulate, and document a kind of a set of values the organization operates by. And it's one of the reasons we're doing this is that as an organization grows, as it gets larger, as it takes on a larger footprint, a lot of the earlier ways of operating don't work in the same ways. So, for example, going back maybe 10 or more years, when we were an organization of about 40 libraries, just about every one of them belonged to the Association of Research Libraries. And you could count on a lot of familiarity based on personal relationships and commonality of purpose and a lot of shared assumptions, even if they weren't explicit. But as you get larger, as your organization grows, you can't rely on those kinds of implicit understandings and personal relationships. When you have a membership of 100, 150, 175 members, you can't do that because it becomes exclusionary. You want to be able to be intentional and deliberate and articulate shared purpose and principles to work by. So in 2019, about almost 2 years ago, it's a long road, we were talking about the need to develop a code of conduct and a statement of values to go along with it. And the board agreed that it was time to do those things. We're thinking about these as an opportunity for the organization to reflect on the purpose and the ways in which we do our work, and an opportunity for us to confirm what we believe and what we felt intuitively. This is not about correcting a problem, neither in the writing up of a statement or a code of conduct. This is about using this as an opportunity to help us reflect and think critically about the role of the organization and the ways we engage with each other. So as a result of that conversation in 2020, the board appointed last year, just about at this time, a statement of values and code of conduct task force in order to put together the code of conduct and the statement of values. That would be self-evident from the name of the task force. Melissa, if you go to the next slide, we'll see the names of the individuals who've been working on this task force. They have been sitting in a quiet mode for several months now, because through last summer, they developed a code of conduct, which was drafted by them. And that code is currently under review by our host institution, University of Michigan. We're essentially an arm of U of Michigan. So we're trying to make sure that our code of conduct is in alignment with whatever policies and practices need to be aligned with at the University of Michigan. The values, the Statement of Values Task Force began looking at a number of materials. They looked at our history of our documentation, the Constitutional Convention that we had in 2011, publications, mission, all that, and really tried to pull out of there themes that they recognized as values that we talked about a lot, that we seem to be emphasizing. But they took a step further, and the sub-team of the task force that was working on this pulled those out, but they also posed a series of questions back to the board and the leadership of the organization to be thinking about. Along the lines of, yes, we state that we're all about providing access, but what does that mean? Access for whom, to whom, under what circumstances? And it really kind of challenged us to think more critically about the role that a statement would play. It's not just about pulling out bullets from a lot of documents and putting them on the website. And so based on that set of questions, on that work that the task force had done, we really determined that the draft of the values needed to be accomplished by the leadership and with the board. So on the next slide, I want to take a transition then to start talking about what these values are. A couple of more notes logistically, just to know the draft that you're going to be seeing today, the statements that you see today, were reviewed by the Board of Governors last October. They were largely drafted by me with Yolanda Cooper, who is now board chair. They're not finished. The wording and even the values themselves probably need some adjustment going into a final version, and that's why we're here today. But the board did think that they were at a state where they could be and should be shared with you all in order to solicit the feedback and understand what more we should be doing or could do to improve them. So I guess I would put this as another way, we can try to make sure that you recognize yourselves and you can say yes to these as we are working them through. On the next slide, I've got just a very quick bulleted list of the values in action, or the values in the statement. The first one is trust. Then we'll talk about access to knowledge and open inquiry, equity, diversity, and inclusion, interdependence and resilience, constructive, meaningful engagement, and then finally leadership and leadership that embodies humility and conviction. Now, we're going to talk about those in detail, and we're going to flash the full statement on screen over the next few minutes. But to do that, as we do that, I'm going to be joined here by Robert McDonald. And Robert, I just want to say thank you for joining us today and welcome from your perch out there at the University of Colorado Boulder. You're the Dean of Libraries there, and you're a member of our Board of Governors. And I wondered if you would just say a few words about your own interest in this work, this process, beyond your role as a member of the board. Why were you willing to spend your time talking about this afternoon?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for including me today. I'm real honored to be here to represent the board, although I see we've got at least one other board member on here with us, which is great, because the whole point here today is to listen to our membership about the values. And I'll tell you, for me, a big part of this is just seeing how the HathiTrust has evolved, over its lifetime. Just as in the first 10 years of the organization, it evolved from shared infrastructure to more shared services. We're now seeing this new area around values for the content and the services we offer. And we need to do that in a way that meets the needs of our membership. I've been involved with HathiTrust for a long time, and as a board member over the last couple of years, was really glad to see this new initiative around values come front and center. I've recently done a new strategic plan at my institution that's a values-based strategic plan that we spent a good bit of time on, really capturing these values. And what I see in the values that HathiTrust is sharing with everybody today is something that does mesh with the values of my library and my institution. And I want to see those, put down in context for the people who will be running HathiTrust, over the next 20 years. And for all the members yet to come. So I'm really happy to be here today and to listen to your comments. And so let's move on to the next part, Mike, to the first slide, and talk a little more in depth.
Okay, great. Thanks, Robert. I really appreciate you being here too. So the first value that we're going to talk about here is one labeled trust. And the statement reads, trust is paramount. It's the basis of our preservation and stewardship mission that we undertake on behalf of the community. And we build this trust through transparency and accountability. And in some ways, I think this is self-evident. It's not, though, right? We say this one is paramount. It's the most important one to start with, because really, if we're not earning your trust through our work, and if we can't know that you're in a position to trust us, then we are going to fail as an organization. It's not just because the word trust is in our name, but literally, HathiTrust cannot do the work we need to do if you don't have confidence in our ability to execute it. in our decision-making, in our processes, our actions, our choices. And that is something that has to be continually earned, right? We have to kind of continually demonstrate why you should trust us, in doing so by being honest about the ways in which we're working, explaining our rationale, owning our mistakes. And I think this particular value, you could see this in the original, like kernel of HathiTrust going back almost 20 years ago, when a number of libraries began to talk to Google about mass digitization and how they would work together and what would happen to the results of their work. And the libraries insisted, vehemently that they needed to have copies of this material in their stewardship because they were the trust agents for the community. They were the trust agents for the culture. They were the organizations that were set about to preserve the works that were in question here. And thank you very much. We'll take care of that. And HathiTrust comes out of that. And so I see what we've been doing over the last 10, 12, 15 years as really building on that continually. Everything we've done in terms of forming the organization has been about ensuring that the membership has insight and say. So Robert, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about this particular value with reference to your own role from a member library in HathiTrust.
Well, I think, trust is a key concept for libraries, not only that we provide unbiased information for our researchers, but also because we tend to be the place that researchers can come with other, service areas for our campus to come together, whether it's around digital humanities or research computing or other areas of teaching and learning and pedagogy. And HathiTrust, needs to have that same level of trust within the membership because we're interdependent with each other in order to support this organization that can really steward this content for the long haul for us. And it's really about that, trust that we want to know that HT is secure and accessible, as well as making shifts over time to provide access to information as it can legally be made available. It's this ability to shift the services over a longer period of time and to pool our investment that makes HT so valuable. And for us as a member library, the service really needs to be built on those investments and have at the forefront the trust that we need as a community. And that's why we went this way to share resources rather than working with something that's a more for-profit entity. And the community efforts that have driven so many of the services of HathiTrust demonstrates the trust that libraries have with each other in our mission and purpose to make information available. And I think this is what we're really after here with the trust among the libraries who make up the membership of HathiTrust.
Great. Thanks. Robert, do you want to kick off the next one?
Absolutely. Let's go to the next slide. And this one is about access to knowledge and open inquiry. And, for me, I mentioned our new strategic plan in Colorado. Our values there are include, empower, connect, learn, and inspire. And I think, for us, we didn't spell out access, but that's a key component of what we were after there, because in all libraries, we have to think about, how we provide that access and what we're providing access to, and how are we including everyone in that ability to access the information. And at the heart of HathiTrust is the vision statement that Mike just went through. HathiTrust will be a vital catalyst for emerging forms of research, teaching, and learning that engage the scholarly and cultural record. And every group needs that vision, they need that mission, and to some degree, they need the purpose and the values. And the more you spell that out, the more it's just front and center for what you do. And I think that's what the board is really after here with this set of values, to get buy-in from the membership, to hear how we can make these values better, but then, to really put them out there so that in the broadest possible sense, you can take a look at these and what what our purpose is, what our mission and vision is, and what we're trying to accomplish as a large group of co-investors in this what I think is one of the greatest things that libraries have ever built for the long term, because we're buying time in order to make more and more available as it becomes available in the public record, in the public domain. And with that, Mike, I'm going to ask you a question. So I talked a lot about the broadest possible access, but that phrase indicates that there are limits. how do you, or how should we as an organization think about these constraints on the content within the context of the values that we're talking about today?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. I think ultimately, as I emphasized earlier, the reason we exist is to provide access to users, right? And supporting our libraries and providing that access. And I think that if trust is fundamental to the way we operate, this value is fundamental to our work and to our identity. But we have to operate within a particular context, and those contexts bring conditions in which you have to kind of frame yourself. Some of the feedback we've already received on the statement of values from folks, there was one particular critique from a couple of folks who were pointing out, it's fine to talk about open access to knowledge and open inquiry, but you're not an open access organization. There are benefits in this membership organization that are reserved to members. There are certain access modes that are not available to all. And that is all true. I try to think about it this way, right? The principle is access, the principle is supporting research. But you do that in a context in which you operate socially, legally, and economically. And for us, it's important to remember that we are not an organization that has formed licensing arrangements and has explicit permission from publishers and rights holders to have digitized this work and include it in our repository. We don't need it, right? We have fair use in the United States to support us on that. But that does mean that we have to recognize that there are multiple interests at stake in this material that we steward, that of rights holders, that of libraries, that of the organizations that funded the digitization. And so we can be constrained both by copyright law as well as contracts that might place limits on how materials to be used. In particular, material that was digitized by Google, they asked that it not be redistributed beyond outside of HathiTrust. They asked that it not be used for commercial purposes and some other, a couple of other points. I think it's really important to recognize that you never uphold all these values perfectly, right? You're always in the process of working towards it. There's a bit of an aspirational element in any statement of values. And it's important to note that that means you don't stop with the constraints, right? You don't just say, well, that's the way it is. You have to continue pushing against and looking for ways to kind of work through those constraints in order to accomplish what you're trying to do. And so, on that note, I'll just say that wherever we've had an opportunity to do so, we have tried and pushed, right? I've met with the Copyright Office in DC to talk about revisions to Section 108 that would really help us in accomplishing our goals and working to provide access for libraries and their users. Similarly, about a year ago this time, we were really crashing out to work on development of the Emergency Temporary Access Service, which was for us, we felt like it was a risky endeavor at the time because we'd never made so much of the copyrighted collection available so broadly as we were planning to do there. And we felt like it was the right thing to do. We had to do it. And in doing so, we were living up to the values that we set for ourselves. So maybe it's a good moment to transition to the next value here and talk a little bit more here about equity, diversity, and inclusion. The statement here notes that those three promote justice, they create communities that thrive and advance knowledge and understanding. And we are working to develop our practices and our actions so that the organization and programs support those principles. I think this is something I would say that we have had in mind, equity of access in particular, from the beginning. The idea that once materials were digitized at scale, there was actually going to be a new way of opening up access to users who were blind or print disabled. Historically, most books were not made available in formats for the blind or print disabled. By digitizing the works, we put them one step closer to being in a form that could be read through machines or reformatted in ways that were useful for them. And so we have developed a pretty extensive set of services and focuses on supporting users with print disabilities through the accessible text request service, for example. But this issue does go beyond accessibility. It does go beyond the needs of users who are print disabled. And last year, we published a statement about our commitment to addressing inequities in our work, acknowledging that structural power relations, structural racism, historical arrangements of the economy have really shaped higher education. And that has in turn shaped the operation of libraries, and that has in turn shaped how collections were built. And it can't help but shape how HathiTrust came to be and who's involved. Though this is a long-term project, though, what we want to try to do is to try to understand that, identify ways in which these are playing out through our organization, and then work to correct those or repair those. This is not something we do in a year. This is something we're going to be doing for the rest of our organizational life. To start with, we put particular emphasis this year on our membership strategy, trying to think about how we can make the membership a more inclusive membership, where we may have put up barriers to involvement in HathiTrust, either through cost or technical requirements or other less tangible actions that we may not be as aware of, and work to create a membership strategy that can be more inclusive. Collections are obviously another big place where this is important. The history of how this collection came together, what's represented in it and what is not represented, is something we have to understand better and work with the rest of our community of members and users to make that transparent and better understood. Those are just two. There's lots of other angles or avenues to work on this. I think instead of trying to enunciate all of those, though, I wanted to ask Robert here about, to think about this and talk about this from your perspective as a library dean. In the last year, a lot of libraries have had, I think, has made organizational commitments about how to address inequities in their services and racism in society and in their organizations. I'm wondering how you see us being able to support you and your colleagues in taking action on those actions, being aligned with and helping support your work in that way too.
Yeah, I think, Mike, all of us are dealing with the issue of DEI justice in our own ways, both personally and organizationally. And as members, member organizations for HathiTrust, we really have to think about the historical bias that we've had in our collecting, our access, our historical slant on what we do collect. In my own institution, for the last 3 to 4 years, we've been working diligently to collect in a period of our history of the Chicanx movement that just was overlooked and uncollected in a lot of ways. And we're trying to work with members of that community to collect it before it's unavailable anymore, because they're all reaching a time, where many are passing away. And that's the kind of thing you have to put out front. You have to say that, you're going to keep working on this long term over the course, over the next 20 years of HathiTrust, like I said, and evolving that. And looking at whose history we're collecting and understanding the bias we come from, as research universities, there's just an inherent bias. And when people ask me, why is this in the HathiTrust and this is not in the HathiTrust? And I got to explain, it's a prototypical picture of the University of Michigan Library built from many, many, many different libraries. But, it's great in that if you want a research library, that's a great library to go to at the University of Michigan. But, it has its inherent bias. And that's why, by pulling in different types of members with different biases, we can take a hard look at that and understand better what we choose to collect and what we choose to preserve for the long term. At my institution, we're embarking on a grand plan around DEI called the IDEA Plan. And, it really permeates all levels of our campus at this point, because we've been working on the plan for about 3 or 4 years. We've kicked off the launch of the plan this year. And it's really forcing every level of leadership and every organization on the campus, whether it's a college like the library or A&S or a research institute, to take a hard look at what they're doing to change, right? We're not asking anymore about, this or that or the other. We're just saying, what's your change management plan for making a difference around the DEI justice initiatives that we want to see on campus? And, that's the same thing that we're doing here, is just putting that out there for the community to comment on and to help us figure out, what's the best path forward and how to keep, pushing on this based on the bias of how our entire operation at HathiTrust and Collection, was set up. And for me personally and for my library, the HT values here really reflect a lot of that. And I think the key question to ask again and again to make sure that the values of the organization are in line with our members are to ask the members about it. What are they seeing from the efforts that we're putting toward this, and what could we be doing that could benefit both HathiTrust and could possibly be applied to collecting at the, at the member library level? And I think that's and vice versa. What are member libraries doing that we could adopt on a larger scale for the digital content in HathiTrust? And I think that's going to be the key question to keep asking and to keep listening as part of the leadership of HathiTrust.
Robert, I'll just add one thing. Sorry,
Yeah.
before just to throw this in. This is unscripted. Just to say that I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about your talk about your own collecting work. There is that. Well, we've been talking about the fact that there's lots of underrepresented areas in our collection, lots of voices not represented. The problem I feel like we have is that we don't actually know what the shape of that is well enough, right? Like, it's not, that there's overrepresentation. You can guess what that looks like, but you can't know all the contours on it until you really start doing a lot more work. And I think working with the libraries like your own to understand that is definitely the only way that can get done. So just wanted to interject that there and offer that support for what you're doing.
That's a great point. I mean, like this year alone, I ended up taking on a sculpture as part of my collection. Now, you ask, I'm not an art museum. Why would I do that? But it's, it was a community-driven project that tells a good bit of the history of the Chicanx movement here on our campus. And it needed a home, right? And the best home for it was one that understood that it was under collecting in that area and needed to make some connections there. And so we did what a typical museum would do to acquire it, and we did acquire it. And what we're hoping from that is it's a cornerstone to drive further parts of the collection we want to go after. And it's the same thing here. What's going to be that focal point that the members bring to the table to say, how do we get this started with HathiTrust, and how do we form, whatever working groups it might take to get the piece or the service to the next level. And with that, we probably could go to the next slide, I think. And this is the one I'm going to kick off a little bit about interdependence. I've talked a little bit about this before, but this value is one that I think needs a little bit of discussion. But the entire history of HT has been about co-investment and interdependence. And it's this overlap that builds the resilience needed for long-term sustainability. And the cost of HT would be something that, I doubt any one of our libraries could really bear by itself. For any length of time. And I brought this up before in that the investment here really buys us time, because by controlling the content in a digital form that we really own together as libraries, we bought time, to see that material eventually will, become more public domain. And the more of that becomes in public domain, the more of that we can make more universally accessible to everybody. And Mike brought this up before, but HT was built on a constitutional convention, and it made me think, I'm rereading Beyond Entrepreneurship right now by Jim Collins and Bill Lazier. And they talk a lot about, great organizations that really put their values out front. One of the ones they talk about is the Constitution of the US. Even with all its bias, it was written so that you could take those values and move things ahead without the key leaders of the day that put them into motion. And I feel like by getting the right buy-in from membership here and expanding our membership in new ways, when I think about the growth in membership, even from when I was first involved with HathiTrust to now, we see the wealth of different organizations and the size. And by putting this out front, it's going to give, basically guideposts, to everyone who comes next. And it's not just locked to the current leadership, but who's next on the board, and who's next in Mike's position, and who's next in all the different kind of program officer positions. They'll have, really good foundation for, their leadership choices. And it's a lot about that, in terms of, we made a choice to go together to invest in this. And I'm really proud and happy about that, because, for a long time, everybody was trying to do this themselves, but the kind of redundancy, the kind of backups, the kind of security and high 9 level of service that you need for this, you have to go together to do it. And it's hard to do. If we hadn't have been able to go together with Michigan as the sponsor, I'm not sure if you could have done it, right? Because otherwise you have to form a group and do all kinds of other things. But my point here is just coming back to the resilience that we've got, and how that buys us time for the preservation of this content, which is the real important part. And the fact that we control it, and not necessarily a for-profit entity controlling it, or someone who has more interest in the intellectual property of the content than in the access. And so with that, I'm going to ask Mike a question a little bit about this. Mike, could you talk a little bit more about the resilience and interdependence angle and what that means for HathiTrust and working with its members?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to say first, thanks for the reflection on the history of the organization and how that interdependence is built into this, because I think that is critical. As I've been thinking about this particular value and what it means, I find that it's the nature of the time. I'm finding it very hard to think about this without articulating it through the context of crisis. I wonder why. I think there was a lot of vision in saying yes, at a time when things are relatively strong and flush, and where there's opportunity abounding, you can create an organization that will help build that resilience, but you don't necessarily know what that looks like until sometimes until a crisis evolves. And I think that's where we've been over the last year and may well be in higher education for the coming few years. Last year, I think when the pandemic came, we kind of recognized the critical need to help libraries ensure continuity of access to collections. And I thought about that a lot in reference to resilience, because the way that what that really meant was the relatively small number of institutions who have deposited in HathiTrust, about 60, compared to the full membership around 190 or so. Those 60 institutions have really carried some weight and helped make it possible for the rest of the organization and themselves really to be able to provide their users with the access that they were needing during the closures and during the constraints of the last year. And I think similarly, the coming few years in higher education are going to be potentially pretty serious, right? There are a lot of institutions that enrollments are not going to dip and they're going to be fine, but we're going to see a lot of challenges throughout the whole strata of higher education, and a lot of organizations are going to be challenged. Libraries are going to be challenged in the same, if their budgets if the institutional budget is shrinking, the library's budget is going to get hit. That's going to have some impact on how the libraries can perform their work. So I like to think about how we can position ourselves as part of that community in order to provide resilience of access throughout the coming several years. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to articulate. And I think it's also important to note that not all forms of dependence or interdependence necessarily lead to resilience, right? You can create a system in which there's a real structural imbalance and reliance on certain agents who, if they were to walk away, would pull the whole house of cards down with them. And that's not the kind of organization and not the kind of effort we're trying to do here. That kind of relates to something else, though, and that has to do with the way that the organizations actually engage with each other. So if we could go to the next slide, I'd like to talk about the next value, the next to last, about constructive and meaningful engagement, which we talk about here as something that ensures our ability to benefit from collective expertise from all of our members, right? That our work has to be done in inclusive environments. Those environments, we have to be valuing the perspectives that people are bringing to them, recognize them as learning opportunities, that they have to be meaningful. We have to create spaces where it's safe for people to be candid and direct and honest about what we're doing, what we're not. This really does tie to the inclusion piece of that we were talking about a few minutes ago. And I also think it ties back, again, I'm going to keep saying this, back to the history, right? A lot of the original work that was done by HathiTrust was done in collective working groups. Michigan was taking the lead on development, but a lot of the decisions about features, functions, initial priorities, services, really done by the membership in collective processes. And this consultative, informative impulse remains important to us. It's harder to do the larger you get. It's harder to do when you become this large, but we need to stay focused on creating meaningful and useful engagement. And I think here, this is where I would directly relate the values to the code of conduct, because the code becomes another way to reflect on the importance of this need, of this value to the organization, and the importance of how the community, the thinking about how the community can and should be engaging with each other. But Robert, engagement is something that every membership organization talks about, something that every library talks about. So I'm wondering whether you recognize or have any thoughts about whether or not it's necessary or important to state this explicitly as a value? Kind of a leading question there, but I'm wondering about how you see its importance playing out here.
Oh, I think this is a key question, and it's good to, just put it out there in the context, because, if you look at how the organization was formed and the growth that's happened, in the last 10 or so years, you'll see different members of HathiTrust putting in different levels of service, and they're in different stages of implementing them. And it's this engagement that's going to make the difference and really provide an equal playing field, so that when you join HathiTrust, whether you're contributing a lot of content or not, you're taking advantages of the services to the utmost that you can for your library. And it's that we need to put out there in a way so that it's really clear what the services are. It's really clear to understand how you can get started, and maybe you can find other members who've implemented things in similar ways, so that you can basically make it easy for yourself to get those going. But this commitment will really ensure the openness and transparency of the decisions of HT, because it's engaged with its members. And everybody tries to do this as a membership organization, but you really just have to keep coming back to it again and again, to ask yourself, am I really listening to my members? Am I really finding out what the needs are, what the roadblocks are? How can I, help them overcome those? And that's what I want us to get to some good discussion today to understand, how do these values line that out for you? And because I really think that's what's important here. And talking about engagement is really going to lead to a better way of connecting with our members. And we've got to do that if we're going to do any of the diversity, equity, and inclusion kinds of programs that we just talked about, right? Because that's where we got to reach the breadth of our membership for it. And with that, I guess we could move to our last value here that we're putting up, right? Which is really about leadership. And, for me, we're committing to leadership that will support the values that we're talking about today. And that's what'll be there. It'll be a path for all the coming leaders that'll be around the table with HathiTrust. And it's a continual process. And I think what we're doing here from an HT standpoint is committing to becoming, a continual student of leadership. And I feel that it's this kind of commitment that's being stressed in this value, and the conviction and humility stressed in this value is the type of lifelong learning that's required of HT leadership, so that it can really support its members both through its services and its collection of content. And I speak for myself on this, but I feel that I want HT to be seen in the next decade as a world leader in this areas of values-based access and preservation, through the shared interdependence that we have as a membership entity of HathiTrust. And I feel like that's going to shine through for us, because not only do we have all this content, we're the steward for it, and we have a rich, sustainable membership model that I think will keep us going. But that's what we can use to showcase why this model works, and why, when we get to needing this kind of a large scale scalable service for libraries, that working together is the best way to go. And Mike, you're the leader of HathiTrust, and you report at the Board of Governors. They've charged you with the responsibility of carrying out this work. Tell me what it means to you, and what you think it might mean, for your successor at some point in the next 10, 20 years, right?
10, 20 years. Wow. So am I going to be working here that long?
Yeah. I'm just going to keep you here forever, right?
One day I'm going to retire, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't want to take too much time here, because we're going to want to get to Q&A, but I do want to say a few things about this, because I think for me, personally, this is one of the most meaningful one. It's one I reflect on more because of my job and because of my role. I think in some ways leadership is a given, right? You're expected to offer a leader, be a leader as an organization and so forth. But what's more important is the way in which you carry that out. And I think these qualities of conviction and humility are kind of necessary and essential to leadership, no matter what field you're working in or in what level you're working in, right? Because conviction means having the confidence of your choices, right? Making sure that you are willing to face challenges and problems, that you don't avoid the hard stuff just because it's uncomfortable or unpleasant. It doesn't mean you're always right. It doesn't mean you're acting quickly. It means you're taking the time to understand whether your choices are the best ones you can be making. And then knowing that, you can go forward. But like I say, it doesn't mean you're always right. And part of the flip side of this is knowing when to recognize that and when to acknowledge it. You will screw up. We will screw up. We have screwed up, right? And we need to know when that is, and not just know it, but acknowledge it, own it, and try to learn from it going forward. And I'm sure many people would be happy to point out the ways in which this plays out for us, but I'm not going to enumerate a list here. Instead, I think it's probably best that we go to question and answer here, because we are a little bit over time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for discussion with the audience today. So just a few questions to be thinking about here on the slide. Your questions don't have to be springing from this. You probably already have some, but please do, if you have a thought, share it with us, a comment, question. And Jessica, I think you're going to MC this part of the conversation for us, right?
That is correct. So you are welcome to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and I will try to catch you there in the participants panel. Not seeing any hands.
While we're waiting on the questions, I just wanted to thank everybody for taking some time out of their day to join us on yet another Zoom call. That sometimes seems endless, but we really do appreciate it, and we really do want to hear from you about anything with the values or anything else you want to bring up about HathiTrust today.
I'm playing school teacher here.
Kenning writing in with a compliment there. Mike and Robert for framing this issue so well. So
thanks, Kenning. And if you guys on the call don't know Kenning already, he's also a member of our board of governors for HathiTrust. And I thought I mentioned him earlier, but I don't know if I called him out by name. But thanks for being here, Kenning.
and if you do have a question, you're welcome to unmute too. We've got, I think, a small enough group here. I know figuring out how to raise your hand can be challenging. We'll go casual.
We'll say that this is the largest group we've had, and yet it's also one of the quietest, which is okay. I just want to make sure we give everybody an opportunity. So,
does anyone think we're missing anything so far in the values? I mean, that was a big question I think the board had as we were kind of parsing through this in the meetings that we spent on it. And, you know, we did our best from the group assembled there, right? But we're looking to see if we have missed anything.
Looked like Kenning had a question for us, and that was to ask about what other questions arose in our other sessions. And that's a good one. I should note, Robert is the third person I've had a conversation with about this. The first two webcasts we did with Carla Strebe from Ohio State and Amy Coulter from Stanford. So each one's been a little bit different, and the audience has all had different perspectives here. You know, I think that folks have really, the thing that stands out for me is some folks have really wanted to really emphasize the necessity of not just talking about these, but linking them to action and being intentional about linking them to action. You know, I don't know of a lot of, honestly, a lot of great models for how that's done. I think we have to improvise that as we go, but I do think it's necessary, right? And I think it is a bit of a challenge, because these things you want to see, they're more meaningful if you can say, okay, right, here's how you're going to go do this. And I think that's the work we have to be doing over the next couple of years. I will tell you that on the last call, I believe it was Yasmin Shorsh from JMU asked a really challenging question. And that was, which of these is the most difficult for us to execute on or to carry out or to uphold? And I'll just reflect, I think that for me personally, it's the one on equity, diversity, and inclusion, in part because of my own positionality, my own history in my life of having opportunities put in front of me that were probably not put in front of other people, and not always recognizing that that's the case. But also because it's such a multidimensional set of issues that come into play there. It's also potentially big, huge, and amorphous. And big, huge, and amorphous power structures and things that you're working against have a way of making you feel powerless and paralytic, and that's how it works, right? And so I think the challenge that I feel in this is knowing what are the baby steps, what are the initial steps, what are the big leaps we can take and we're best positioned to take and urge along, and really then how to keep your energy on it even when you're not moving as quickly as you would like to do on that. So that's just a couple of reflections on previous points. So
I think Claire is poised to ask a question.
Oh, hi, thank you so much. I thought that was a really great discussion. And I'm a new member of the board, but have a long history with HathiTrust. I was on the collections committee for the first 6 years of the its existence, and then stepped away from HathiTrust. So I feel like I'm still kind of relearning the organization. And one of the things I love is how many webinars and kind of opportunities to engage, how many more of them there are now. I'm really intrigued by this concept of how can HathiTrust be accountable, and I wondered if you could talk a bit more about what the planning or thinking is there. And just to throw out something that really struck me yesterday, I was reading a blog post from the Law Librarians of Congress about Facebook's new Supreme Court, where they had sort of a much more public process of reflecting on things that had come up that were maybe challenging or controversial, and then sharing that assessment back with the community broadly, and then there's sort of another layer of then having the law librarians provide expert commentary. And there's something about that I really love. It embraces kind of a radical transparency sort of embrace and another way of engaging experts. So I'll just throw that out maybe as an idea, but I'm really fascinated by this accountability a concept, and how it just seems incredibly important to being real about all this.
Yeah, it is. It's about it's also not about just simply saying, hey, look at all the good things we did, right? It's not about doing the annual report with the pretty pictures in it. I think it depends how you hold yourself accountable, how you not demonstrate, but how you are accountable to the membership, I think varies depending upon what the issue is for you. This is more a little bit hypothetical at this moment, but thinking ahead to when we complete the code of conduct and have a code of conduct committee and have a process for doing that. I've been talking with the chair of the code of conduct committee a lot about how we ensure that that process has integrity, how it is, upfront, seen as something people can trust, and then that there is follow through if there is something that needs to be dealt with. The trick there is that you also want to, in some cases like that, you want to preserve some ability to hold things private, right? To protect privacy of particular individuals. People might report, based on wanting to remain quiet or not have their name used. And that poses a little bit of a challenge. But I think one of the things that we know we need to do there is always report when there has been something that has happened and acknowledge we have taken action or not, and that's kind of built into that process as we've conceived it going ahead. There was one other place, this is not exactly related, Claire, but I think that one thing that we've been having some conversations about recently is internally how we steward the collection, how we manage metadata. We are kind of a second order curator of the collection as it is right now, and don't take a lot of direct action on the metadata, but we do then at the same time, we are seen as accountable for it because it's here. And I think we need to do a better job of talking about how the collection is created. And we were talking yesterday about providing more contextualizing information about what's in the collection, how it's created, how it came to be, and how it's described. And then, not just say this is the way it is and that's the way it goes, but also to say that's a starting point for understanding how we can make some changes there, and then demonstrating that over time. I don't know if those are adequate responses to your question. There's just a couple of places where I have been thinking about it. So.
I do see a question from Beth, unless Robert, you want to add on to Mike's comments there. Didn't mean to jump in ahead of you.
Oh, no, that's fine. We probably should have moved to the next questions, but I just wanted to thank Claire for that one. I mean, that's a tough one when you look at overall, when you put your values out there, and lots of orgs and lots of companies do that. And, you want the right kind of metrics for being accountable for it, but most of it is just about making your decisions with those values at the forefront for you, and then if you do that enough, you've got things to show that are changing, and if you do see issues that need some real change management, making sure that you put the resources into it.
Beth asks, can HathiTrust do more advocacy for information sharing through promoting library issues like copyright, fair use, public domain, and controlled digital lending? A value is information access, which all these enable.
I would say we could probably always be doing more advocacy on those things. I think maybe implicit in the question is that there's a way in which advocacy occurs through the actions you take, not just in the things you say. And I'm thinking about that in terms of how we the reference to controlled digital lending makes me think about our work to provide access to the copyrighted material during the pandemic. Kind of taking a stand and saying, yeah, we have to do this. It is necessary and it is justified and it's lawful, and kind of opening up the door and establishing some precedent, some groundwork for the way that can be done. I think that we probably we talk a lot about what we do. We don't always talk about the meaning of what we do and the impact of what we do and why and what should change and how we can be working towards that. And so I kind of take your comments to heart there, Beth, about not just saying how, but thinking about the necessity of doing more of it. So I would probably just say that for now because we're running up on time. So.
And we had another question there from Anne about the common understanding of public domain. And I think that's a little along the same lines of advocacy, because that's always a big issue in everything we do, connecting back to, US copyright law and the possible exemptions that libraries have and the interpretation of that and what we can do. And I think ETOS is a great example of that. Because when you are within the bounds of the law, you can provide a lot of great access in new ways, especially when you can control the content. And I'm sure Mike has more to say on that too.
I do. I'm not going to try though, because it's already 2 o'clock.
Oh, we already hit the hour, aren't we?
Not trying to take an out on that. Just recognizing the time. So, Jessica, why don't I turn it over to you to wrap up here and talk about what's remaining in the process?
Absolutely. So we will be taking in everything that we've heard today, everything in the chat, as well as looking at the survey results when they're in. So if you have not already done so, I invite you to complete the survey. We'll send out the link after this webinar. We'll be taking the survey submissions until the end of the day on Friday. We'll also, in the course of the next few weeks, be getting back to the membership on sort of what we've learned through this process. And then we'll be carrying on from there for revisions. And then, as I mentioned before, putting the final and revised statement of values, put that forth to the member representatives in May for a vote. So that's where we're headed.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Jessica, for that. And thanks.
Thank
I just want to say
you.
thanks to everybody else for coming this afternoon or this morning. I really appreciate your taking time. So
Thank you all. Great to see you.
great
Thanks for
day.